A few years ago, I made a video about the white savior trope that Hollywood loves to use in many of its blockbusters. In most recent times, that included Tom Cruise's The Last Samurai and James Cameron's Avatar. Wikipedia summarizes this trope in one sentence by stating, "The white savior is a cinematic trope in which a white character rescues non-white characters from unfortunate circumstances." A couple years after that, I made a new video about how, as an Arab, I can relate to Marvel's Black Panther, where for once we have a billion-dollar action movie where people of color are their own saviors. The white savior trope is often a component of Orientalism, whether the movie or book is set in the Middle East, North Africa, or Asia, like in Lawrence of Arabia. So while in 2018 it seemed that Hollywood finally understood that people of color do not need saving, and instead wish to tell our own blockbuster stories, like in 2018's Black Panther, Wonder Woman 1984 said no. Let's go back to the 80s, not only with our story, but also with our stereotypes. Orientalism, by the way, is the representation of an Easterner in a stereotyped way that is regarded as embodying a colonialist attitude. In an interview talking about the movie Fences, Denzel Washington speaks about why it is so important to have a black director for the film. He explained that you can be an excellent director, however, if you have an understanding of the core culture the movie was made about, it'll make a big difference. This brings us to Wonder Woman. How much did the director of Wonder Woman 1984 know about Egypt's culture? Before I continue, beware. I am about to spoil Wonder Woman 1984 for you, more than its own writer and director did. Starring Gal Gadot, this Wonder Woman sequel is the perfect example of white saviorism and Orientalism. While the Wonder Woman franchise is often applauded for its feminist stance, featuring a woman with superpowers, social media highlighted a number of scenes where her latest movie slips into the typical negative stereotypes often shown in Hollywood when it comes to representing Arabs. The 1980s had both good and bad aspects when it came to its movies. Some of the greatest movies from the decade that I enjoyed as a child also had negative portrayals of North Africans and Middle Easterners. From the Arab swordsmen in The Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Libyan terrorists in Back to the Future, and the Lebanese kidnappers in Delta Force. Unfortunately, the director Patty Jenkins crafts her version of Egypt and the grander Middle East and North Africa region out of the same oversimplifications we've seen about this part of the world for years. The Palestinian-German filmmaker Lexi Alexander, who directed Marvel's The Punisher: Warzone 2008, said, "The problems with Wonder Woman are representative of an industry that considers itself progressive while consistently excluding marginalized voices and punishing those who fight back, and of a culture that still actively resists any attempt to portray Arabs in a humanizing light. People do not know Arabs as anything other than oil sheikhs who have harems, or as terrorists, or in the rare quote-unquote woke cases, people who get to help the CIA." In this film, the supervillain Pascal Maxwell Lord visits the Egyptian Emir Said bin Abydos, an oil magnate who's holding Lord's plans to seize in exchange for granting a wish with an ancient magic stone he now controls. A significant portion of the movie is set in Egypt, where the country looks like a typical stereotype of what an ancient Middle Eastern city would look like. A city-wide dusty old souk filled with old buildings that looks more at home in 1684 than in 1984. This typical Hollywood version of the Middle East is of course populated with characters you would expect to find in this setting, such as Emir Said bin Abydos, an Egyptian leader who wants to build a wall to protect his country's oil from the Saudis. Everything shown in this mythical version of Egypt is the complete opposite of what Egypt was really like in 1984. There was no monarch in Egypt at the time. King Farouk, the last king of Egypt, was disposed in the mid-1950s, and during the time the film was set, Hosni Mubarak had already taken over the presidency for 3 years, following the assassination of his predecessor, Anwar Sadat. What made the Emir, who was played by Egyptian actor Amro Waked, even more of a stereotype is the way he was dressed, because to put it bluntly, no Egyptian who wanted to be taken seriously, ever, in the history of the 20th century, dressed like he did, unless perhaps they were going to a costume party. His character's costume, like his identity, is a mishmash of different styles that did not add up, with a headscarf and a three-piece grey pinstriped suit underneath, an open blue robe with a gold trim. Although traditional Egyptian male dress includes garments like a long dark overcoat, the Emir's look is more in line with the styles of the Gulf, where it is customary to wear a ghutra and igal and kandora, the headpiece and the thobe. Even the women in Wonder Woman's Cairo, including a young girl who Diana saves from a speeding truck, who all wear hijabs and niqabs, are not, in any way, a typical reflection of Egypt during the 80s. During that period in Egyptian history, wearing those items was actually quite controversial. It just was not the casual norm. It was during this scene that other Arab academics found issues that goes back up to our white savior trope. After Wonder Woman saves these children from being run over, she advised them in Arabic to stay clear of the road or highway, assuming that the children were either too dumb to realize that a speeding convoy was heading their way, or that the Egyptian bad guys were evil enough to run them over anyway. The scene was completely unnecessary. I personally believe that the only thing they got right was the taxi in the car chase scene. An old black and white Peugeot. Everything else was a misrepresentation. Hopefully Patty Jenkins and Gal Gadot can stay out of Egypt for a while. Or at least until they learn about its history.
Wait.
Okay, wait a second. My son is saying something to me. Hold on.
They're making another movie about Cleopatra next year.
Really? Seriously? Okay, so Patty Jenkins will direct Gal Gadot in Cleopatra next year. So here we go again. I guess Egypt can't catch a break. Although I defined Orientalism earlier, I think it deserves more explanation. Edward Said, the author of Orientalism in 1978, explores the impact of colonialism and the Western perception of countries that have been colonized. His specific interest, like mine, was how the West viewed Arabs and Muslims. It was obvious in Western literature that Middle Easterners were viewed as inferior. And almost 50 years after his book was published, we can still see this dominant thought in movies, like I mentioned, modern music videos, and literature. The overall image that we are portrayed in is that we are backward and ignorant, vulgar, and in the case of music videos, very exotic and mystical. I remember being in Chicago in the late 90s at Wilbur Wright College in an English literature class. Among only a few students in that class who were Arab, I was put in a position in several class discussions where I had to explain how our culture works and even defend our beliefs and ideology, as the other students attacked with a bombardment of questions and accusations because it was so incomprehensible to them as Westerners. As a 19-year-old, I didn't have all the answers. I hadn't even heard of Edward Said until a few years ago. The complaints were always about women oppression, violence, and Ramadan, where we fast for a month, and how our culture and practices were so tough and impractical. Today, my 11-year-old son Abdullah tells me that online gamers ask him all the time if he's a terrorist. 25 years later, I can see that things have not improved for us. Although it is very painful for him, Abdullah is mature enough to accept that there are many ignorant people out there. And we are learning, together, how to deal with bullies. I guess it never ends. Because of what me and my family are experiencing, I have decided that the purpose of this channel will be to fight the stereotypes of Middle Easterners and to introduce our culture to the world. Like any society out there, we are not perfect, but maybe if I make enough videos, some Westerners will be less judgmental. I am definitely not done with explaining Orientalism, and I've decided to make a series of upcoming episodes in collaboration with the Mysterious Middle East channel to explain Orientalism roots and impact on the world we live in. Perhaps instead of having a white savior, we can save ourselves this time. May God help us all. I hope you enjoyed this video. Tell me what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to support this channel on Patreon.